I thought I understood the tragic backstories until I analyzed every single Batman villain's backstory. What I discovered completely changed everything I believed about villain origins for a sad reason. So in this video, I'm going to reveal which Batman villain has the most tragic backstory. And trust me, what you're about to learn will change how you look at every villain's story. First, I need to show you something about genetic discrimination that changes everything about how we measure childhood trauma. Waylon Jones, better known as Killer Croc, represents complete biological rejection from birth. After his mother died giving birth to him and his father having abandoned him, he was left to be raised by his alcoholic and abusive aunt. Born with a rare medical condition that gradually transformed his appearance to resemble a crocodile, Waylon faced rejection from the moment he drew breath. But here's what makes his case unique. His aunt didn't just neglect him. She forced him to scrub his scales off daily, causing excruciating pain. Physical torture by guardians triggers what I call the betrayal amplification effect. When the people meant to protect you become your tormentors, standard trauma measurements multiply exponentially. The other kids tormented him relentlessly at school. By 16, he was in adult prison where systemic brutalization pushed his final devastation levels even higher. But here's what shocked me when I analyzed the long-term progression. Genetic-based tragedy compounds indefinitely because his condition worsens with age. Unlike other trauma that can theoretically heal, Killer Croc's suffering operates on a linear progression that never plateaus. Social isolation increases annually because his physical transformation continues. This creates a trajectory that theoretically reaches extreme levels given sufficient time, but it's still nothing compared to what we'll examine later. But here's what really made me recalculate everything. Systematic imprisonment from birth. Born to serve the life sentence of his father, Bane's childhood and early adult life are spent behind the walls of Penaduro, an infamous prison located in Santa Prisca. His father was a revolutionary who escaped the court system, so the government decreed that his newborn son would serve the life sentence instead. Picture this, a baby sentenced to life in prison for crimes he didn't commit. Bane spent his entire childhood surrounded by murderers and thieves. He never experienced safety, never knew love, never had a childhood. He committed his first murder at the age of 8, stabbing a criminal attempting to use him to gain information about the prison.
The mercenary understood that was the daughter who had secured his release, but what he could not know was the true price of his freedom. She took his place in the pit. And she was with child, the mercenary's child. One day, the doctor forgot to lock the cell, but the child had a friend. The mother was not so lucky.
The kid never had a chance at a normal life. The prison became his university, teaching him that strength and intelligence were the only currencies that mattered. But what makes Bane's case fascinating from an analytical perspective is how he transformed systematic injustice into personal power. His tragedy created strength rather than weakness, which partially offsets the devastation levels. Now, let me show you exactly what happens when heroic potential gets corrupted by psychological warfare. Harvey Dent's case study reveals devastation patterns that transcend individual suffering and enter systemic destruction territory. Harvey Dent's childhood consisted of hardship. Growing up under an abusive father, he developed repressed mental illnesses of his own, such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Harvey's childhood abuse already registers severe levels, but watch what happens when we factor in the methodology his father used. The coin flip punishment system created a unique psychological architecture that amplifies everything else. When children cannot predict safety versus danger, their psychological development creates fractured decision-making systems. Despite this nightmare childhood, Harvey climbed his way to becoming Gotham's youngest district attorney at 26. The media nicknamed him Apollo, charming, good-looking, seemingly untouchable. Batman trusted him. Commissioner Gordon respected him. His heroic status created expectation amplifiers that made his eventual fall exponentially more devastating. Here's why heroic status makes tragedy worse. The higher you climb, the more devastating the fall becomes. Standard criminal to villain transformation operates on relatively flat trajectories, but hero to villain transformations create exponential curves where the psychological impact multiplies based on lost potential. Then Sal Maroni threw acid in his face during a trial. The alliance ended tragically when Sal, Boss Maroni, believing Dent to be responsible for the death of his father, threw acid in his face during a trial. The physical disfigurement triggered complete psychological fragmentation that released years of suppressed mental illness. But there's a critical psychological factor that makes Two-Face's case theoretically impossible to resolve. The dual personality creates infinite feedback loops of self-destruction. Traditional recovery becomes impossible when the victim and the perpetrator occupy the same consciousness. Harvey Dent tries to heal, while Two-Face sabotages recovery efforts continuously.
Hello.
Dent, Jesus, I thought he was dead.
Half. Who picked up Rachel words?
The Maroney's man.
Shut up!
Listen, Dan, I swear to God, I didn't know what they were gonna do to you.
That's funny. Because I don't know what's gonna happen to you either.
But here's what happens when aristocratic privilege meets social rejection. Born Oswald Chesterfield Cobblepot, the Penguin was bullied as a child for his short stature, weight, way of walking, and beak-like nose. The Penguin represents a different category entirely: elite society destruction combined with physical deformity and maternal psychological manipulation. Oswald Cobblepot's tragedy operates on elite society rejection parameters that create unique suffering profiles. Born into wealth but physically malformed, he experienced rejection from his own social class while lacking the sympathy usually granted to the poor. This creates double negative devastation where neither wealth nor poverty provide psychological shelter. His siblings, Jason, Robert, and William, died not long after his father, Tucker Cobblepot, also passed away from pneumonia, and now Oswald was the sole heir to the Cobblepot legacy. His mother, whom he'd cared for, could not take the trauma of losing 3 of her sons and her husband and became catatonic. The family devastation created isolation that compounded his existing social rejection. But what shocked me when I analyzed the long-term progression was how the Penguin's criminal success actually increases his devastation levels over time. Unlike other villains who find satisfaction in revenge, Cobblepot's victories remind him of what legitimate success could have been. Every criminal achievement highlights the heroic path he was denied through social prejudice. Now, I need to show you something about intellectual superiority complexes that create entirely different tragedy architectures. Born into a broken home, Edward was raised by his abusive father, whose violence may have been a part of Ed's growing obsession with telling the truth and proving himself superior. Edward Nygma, the Riddler, operates on psychological frameworks where intelligence became associated with punishment. The Riddler's father would beat him for being too smart, creating inverted reinforcement where his greatest strength became his greatest liability. Standard abuse can be compartmentalized, but intellectual abuse creates system-wide psychological damage. When your core identity becomes your trauma trigger, recovery requires abandoning who you are fundamentally. The young Edward snuck into the school at night, practicing the puzzle until he could solve it in seconds. His obsessive need to prove intellectual superiority stems from childhood beatings for academic achievement. The contradiction creates cognitive dissonance where success generates fear rather than satisfaction. But here's where Riddler's tragedy becomes uniquely self-destructive. His criminal methodology forces him to provide Batman with clues, ensuring his own capture. The self-sabotage creates intentional failure loops that compound existing trauma. Every puzzle he creates guarantees his own downfall, but his psychology demands he continues creating them. But there's something even more devastating about fear-based childhood trauma that makes everything else look manageable. Jonathan Crane was born out of wedlock to a reluctant mother, Karen Keeney, and a non-existent father, Gerald Crane. Jonathan Crane, the Scarecrow, experienced terror that created permanent psychological damage focused specifically on fear response systems. His great-grandmother was a strict old woman who made Jonathan labor in the fields and forbade him from partaking in things like Halloween or leisurely reading. But here's what makes Scarecrow's case unique from an analytical perspective. Punishment meant being locked in a chapel filled with attacking crows. Forced to dress in his Sunday best, Jonathan would be locked inside and attacked by hungry crows. His great-grandmother had created a special formula of wildfowl pheromones and rat juices to sprinkle on his suit, attracting the angry scavengers. This isn't standard child abuse. This is systematic terror designed to break psychological development. At school, kids picked on him, calling him names like handrail and scarecrow. But here's what shocked me when I researched the long-term psychological impact. He became obsessed with conquering fear by studying and weaponizing it. The intellectual pursuit of his own trauma creates feedback loops where studying fear generates more fear. But what really convinced me that fear-based tragedy operates differently was analyzing Crane's victim creation patterns. Unlike other villains who target enemies, Scarecrow's psychology compels him to create fear in innocence. This generates guilt devastation that compounds his existing trauma exponentially. Every victim he creates reminds him of his own childhood helplessness. Now, let me show you exactly what happens when scientific ambition meets accidental transformation. Matt Hagen is the second Clayface, and he is the first to demonstrate shape-shifting powers after encountering a radioactive pool of protoplasm.
I'd like to ask Mr. Daggett. I hear he's selling Renew You through marketing because stores won't carry it.
Well, that's absolutely untrue.
Why don't you show them what an overdose can do? Why don't you
Tell them about me.
Matt Hagen was a treasure hunter who gained shape-shifting abilities through chemical exposure, but required constant renewal from the radioactive source. Initially, this seems less tragic than our previous cases. Hagen gained incredible powers and wasn't born into suffering. But here's what makes his situation unique. The power dependency created technological imprisonment that required constant maintenance. Unlike natural abilities, Hagen's powers demanded regular exposure to dangerous radiation just to maintain his transformed state. But there's another version of Clayface whose tragedy operates on even more devastating parameters. At one time, Matt Hagen was a famous actor, but he became facially disfigured after a car accident. The transformation was involuntary. It was caused by accidental exposure while trying to maintain his acting career after facial disfigurement destroyed his livelihood. When your career depends on your appearance and that appearance gets destroyed, the psychological architecture collapses. Hagen's entire identity was wrapped up in his ability to portray characters. The car accident didn't just damage his face, it destroyed his sense of self completely. The chemicals that gave him shape-shifting abilities seemed like salvation at first, but here's what shocked me when I analyzed the identity implications. When you can become anyone, you cease to be anyone. The philosophical devastation pushes trauma levels beyond standard measurements. Every transformation reminds him of what he's lost, his original identity. Using his powers generates trauma rather than satisfaction because each change reinforces his fundamental emptiness. But there's something even more shocking about corporate betrayal combined with love-based motivation that most people miss. I need to introduce you to a case that breaks all conventional measurement systems. But first, let me reveal that psychological factor I mentioned earlier. Before I do that though, if you're enjoying the video so far and want to join my Discord server filled with other comic fans, click the link in the description now. This is the moment everything changes. Victor Fries was a scientist hoping to cure his wife of her fatal disease, but a lab accident left him incapable of surviving outside of freezing cold. Victor Fries wasn't born into tragedy like our previous cases. He lived a normal, happy life until one moment of corporate cruelty destroyed everything. Mr. Freeze's baseline tragedy starts relatively low compared to our previous examples, but watch what happens when we apply the love multiplication factor. Victor wasn't just a husband trying to save his wife. He was a brilliant scientist with unlimited resources and determination. The combination of intellectual capability and emotional investment creates exponential amplifiers that shatter conventional measurement systems. Nora Fries suffered from a terminal illness that medical science couldn't cure, but Victor refused to give up. He worked tirelessly in his cryogenics lab, developing technology to freeze her body and keep her in suspended animation until he could find a cure. This wasn't just hope, it was scientific methodology applied to love with unlimited resources backing the research. Then corporate greed destroyed everything.
100 meters to surface, Captain. Possibly a cave. All back 1/3.
15 years today, darling. The day we met was the happiest day of my life. A gift for you. Fragile beauty clinging to life like you, Nora.
How long does she have to stay in there?
Until a cure can be found.
Ferris Boyle, his money-hungry boss, discovered the expensive cryogenic project and ordered it shut down. When Victor refused to let his wife die, Boyle sabotaged the experiment. The chemical explosion didn't just destroy Victor's work, it altered his body permanently, making it impossible for him to survive outside sub-zero temperatures. Here's something that shocked me when I researched the corporate sabotage implications. Ferris Boyle's interference created permanent survival dependency on artificial life support. The devastation jumps exponentially due to technological imprisonment factors combined with the love motivation driving every decision. Normal human existence operates within environmental parameters that allow basic survival. Victor's transformation requires constant technological intervention to maintain life. This creates dependency devastation that multiplies existing trauma because survival itself becomes a constant reminder of loss and failure. But there's a critical factor that makes technological imprisonment unique among tragedy types. Unlike psychological trauma that exists in mental space, Victor's suffering manifests as physical reality every moment he's alive. His refrigerated suit isn't just equipment, it's a perpetual reminder of his failure constructed from the same technology that was supposed to save Nora. The irony factor measures how closely salvation and damnation relate to each other. Victor's case registers maximum irony levels because his survival technology and Nora's preservation technology are identical. Every breath he takes reminds him of every breath she's not taking. This relationship ensures trauma compounds compounds rather than diminishes over time. But here's the factor that makes this completely impossible to measure, and it's not what you think. He turns to crime to fund his research in his obsessive quest to cure Nora by any means necessary, which brings him into conflict with Batman. The tragedy operates on compound interest principles that create infinite acceleration rather than finite resolution. Let me show you why this creates impossible psychological scenarios. Every day Nora remains frozen increases Victor's desperation, but desperation drives criminal behavior that increases guilt daily. The combined progression means Mr. Freeze's suffering increases continuously rather than plateauing like normal trauma responses. Unlike finite trauma that can theoretically heal, Mr. Freeze's suffering compounds over time. Every passing moment makes the situation objectively worse rather than better. The progression never stops because the central problem never resolves and actually becomes more difficult as years pass without breakthrough. When I calculated the projected trajectory, I couldn't believe the results. The temporal dynamics eliminate any possibility of natural recovery or adaptation. Every passing moment increases the psychological burden rather than providing opportunities for healing or acceptance like standard grief processes. But here's what really convinced me. This case breaks all measurement systems. Every other villain eventually finds twisted satisfaction in their evil. The Joker revels in chaos, generating positive psychological feedback from successful schemes. Two-Face achieves balance through duality, creating satisfaction whenever his coin flip determines outcomes. Bane takes pride in strength, receiving psychological rewards from displays of physical dominance. Even our most damaged cases find some form of satisfaction. Killer Croc gains acceptance from underground communities. The Penguin enjoys wealth and power that society denied him. The Riddler feels superior when solving complex puzzles. Scarecrow experiences control over the fear that once controlled him. Mr. Freeze gains nothing from crime except funding for an impossible goal. His criminal satisfaction remains permanently at zero because crime isn't his objective. It's merely the means to an impossible end. The hopelessness approaches infinity as time progresses without any positive reinforcement to offset increasing desperation and guilt. The psychological dynamics create scenarios where suffering increases exponentially while satisfaction remains constant at zero. This violates basic human adaptation principles where even negative situations eventually generate some form of psychological equilibrium through acceptance or rationalization. Now, I need to show you that critical comparison factor I mentioned. Mr. Freeze has evolved wildly over the years, initially appearing in the Silver Age as a fairly standard goofy villain. The character transformation from basic criminal motivation into Batman's most sympathetic villain reveals something profound about tragedy measurement systems. The original version registered standard criminal motivation focused on freezing-based crimes for profit. No personal investment, no emotional stakes, no love complications. Basic revenge against Batman represented typical villain psychology with measurable parameters and logical progression patterns. But Batman the Animated Series writer Paul Dini created tragedy levels that transcended measurement capabilities by introducing the love-loss impossibility triangle. This triangle creates feedback loops where each component amplifies the others indefinitely. Love intensifies loss perception. Loss makes recovery impossible. Impossibility deepens love through desperation. The system becomes self-sustaining and exponentially destructive. Traditional villain motivation operates on linear reward systems where crime success generates satisfaction. But the love-loss impossibility triangle creates inverse relationships where success paradoxically increases suffering rather than decreasing it. But here's what happens when you compare finite tragedy to infinite tragedy systems. Killer Croc's suffering peaked during childhood and plateaued at measurable maximum levels. Two-Face's trauma reached maximum intensity during his disfigurement with identifiable boundaries. Bane's prison experience had definable beginning and endpoints with trauma stabilizing at sustainable levels. Even Scarecrow's fear-based trauma, while self-reinforcing, operates within psychological boundaries that prevent infinite expansion. The human psyche develops adaptation mechanisms that eventually stabilize suffering at levels the mind can process and survive long-term. Mr. Freeze's tragedy operates like compound interest with no principal repayment option. Every passing moment increases the debt. Every crime adds guilt multipliers. Every failed experiment deepens desperation without providing offsetting satisfaction or progress toward resolution. Let me reveal the next factor that makes this analysis definitive. The mirror effect between Mr. Freeze and Batman creates unique measurement complications that highlight the infinite nature of Victor's suffering. Both men lost the people they loved most. Both dedicated their lives to fighting that loss. Both use advanced technology to pursue their goals with unlimited resources and determination. The critical difference that changes everything. Bruce Wayne's parents were already gone when he began his crusade. Victor Fries fights for someone who might still be saved. The hope factor creates exponential suffering multipliers that finite loss loss cannot match, because hope without resolution generates more psychological damage than despair with acceptance. Batman's tragedy stabilized after accepting his parents' death and finding purpose in preventing similar losses. The forward-looking mission structure provides positive reinforcement that offsets grief gradually over time. Crime prevention success generates satisfaction that heals psychological wounds through meaningful purpose. But Victor's hope prevents psychological closure completely. Every day Nora doesn't wake up isn't acceptance of loss. It's another day of active failure to achieve the impossible. The brain cannot process infinite recursive loops of potential salvation followed by continued failure without eventually breaking down completely. When I visualized what perpetual hope does to human psychology, the impossibility became clear. Finite loss allows for grief processing cycles that eventually reach acceptance and healing. Infinite potential loss prevents grief processing from the beginning because the loss isn't technically final, creating psychological limbo that exceeds human capacity. But here's what makes this even more devastating: the moral compass destruction analysis that separates Mr. Freeze from every other villain in Batman's rogues gallery. Other villains embrace evil or rationalize criminal behavior through ideology or psychological frameworks that provide justification and reduce internal conflict. The Joker believes chaos is natural and necessary. Two-Face thinks balance requires both good and evil existing in equal measure. Bane considers strength the ultimate virtue that justifies any action. These belief systems allow them to commit crimes without psychological conflict or guilt accumulation. Mr. Freeze remains haunted by his ethical framework while being unable to operate within it. He knows crime is wrong. He knows violence hurts innocence. He knows Nora would disapprove of his methods. But the alternative is letting her die, which his psychology cannot accept under any circumstances. The contradiction creates cognitive dissonance that compounds existing tragedy measurements continuously. Every crime increases guilt. Every moral compromise deepens self-hatred. Every day of survival in his cryosuit reminds him of his technological imprisonment and failure to save the person he loves most. Here's something that shocked me when I researched recovery possibility analysis across Batman's entire rogues gallery. Killer Croc could theoretically undergo therapy and social integration programs. His tragedy stems from social rejection that could be addressed through acceptance and community building approaches with measurable progress potential. Two-Face has shown moments of Harvey Dent personality recovery during various storylines. The dual personality creates theoretical possibilities for psychological integration therapy that could reunify his fractured psyche through professional intervention and medication management. Bane could redirect his intelligence toward legitimate goals and channel his strength into positive pursuits. His tragedy stems from systematic injustice that could be addressed through legal reform and personal agency development with concrete actionable steps. Even Scarecrow's fear obsession could theoretically be redirected toward helping others overcome phobias through legitimate psychological practice. His expertise in fear psychology has therapeutic applications that could prove positive outlets for his knowledge and experience. But Mr. Freeze's central problem cannot be solved through psychological intervention because the tragedy source remains active and compounding. Nora stays frozen, time continues to pass. Hope compounds desperation daily. Medical science hasn't advanced enough to cure her condition, and the probability decreases as decades pass without breakthrough. The recovery impossibility creates tragedy perpetuation that exceeds all measurement scales. When traditional healing becomes impossible due to external circumstances beyond psychological control, suffering achieves infinite status that transcends normal human capacity for processing loss. When I calculated the next devastation rankings across Batman's entire rogues gallery, the results shattered every preconception about villain tragedy measurement. Standard measurements place most Batman villains as severe but ultimately finite suffering levels that can theoretically be processed and healed through various intervention methods. Mr. Freeze's infinite progression model scored beyond system limitations entirely. While other villains peaked at specific trauma levels and eventually stabilized through adaptation or rationalization, Victor's compound suffering approaches infinity as temporal variables increase without any offsetting positive developments or resolution possibilities. This isn't close. It's impossible for any finite tragedy to compete with infinite systems that compound rather than diminish over time. Mr. Freeze stands alone as Batman's most tragic villain because his suffering operates on exponential rather than linear progression models that exceed human psychological survivability thresholds. If you enjoyed this analysis and want to see every leak that spoiled Superman, click here now.